Growing up, I always felt like I was living in someone else's shadow. My name is Ethan, and I'm 32. My twin brother Alex was always the center of attention, the one who could do no wrong. People often assume twins are inseparable, sharing an unbreakable bond, but for us, that was never the case. Alex was the golden child, the one my parents believed in, while I was just the other one. I worked hard in school, brought home awards, and even won competitions, but my achievements were met with a polite, good job, at best. Meanwhile, if Alex managed to scrape by in a class, they would throw a small celebration. It became clear to me early on that no matter what I did, I would always come second. By the time I was a teenager, I had stopped trying to impress them. There was no point. I decided that the best thing I could do was leave and build a life for myself. At 18, I left home. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew I needed to escape the constant comparisons. The first few years were tough. I worked long hours, took any job I could find, and saved every penny. Slowly, I managed to scrape together enough to open a small coffee shop. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something meaningful. That's when I met Lauren. She walked into my cafe one morning, and something about her stood out. Her smile, her laugh, the way she carried herself. She became a regular, and before long, I found myself looking forward to every moment we spent together. Over time, we started dating, and it just felt right. Lauren was everything I had hoped for in a partner: kind, supportive, and grounded. She believed in me in a way no one else ever had, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was part of a team. A few years later, I proposed, and soon after, we found out Lauren was pregnant. When our son Jake was born 7 years ago, it was the happiest day of my life. Holding him in my arms, I felt like everything I had worked for finally made sense. I was creating the kind of family I had always dreamed of, one filled with love, stability, and trust. My relationship with my parents and Alex remained distant, but they adored Jake. Alex even started visiting more often, and while we weren't particularly close, I figured he was trying to be a good uncle. For the first time in years, I thought things were finally falling into place. Life felt stable. My business was thriving, Lauren and I were happy, and Jake was growing up to be an incredible little boy. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A few months ago, Jake had a minor accident while playing outside. At first, it seemed like nothing serious, just one of those childhood scrapes. But when he didn't recover as quickly as expected, we took him to the hospital. That's when we learned he needed a blood transfusion. Lauren and I immediately volunteered, confident one of us would be a match. I mean, why wouldn't we be? But when the nurse returned with the results, she looked concerned. She explained that neither Lauren nor I were compatible donors. I remember laughing nervously, thinking there must have been some kind of mix-up. How could neither of us be a match? The nurse, however, assured us that mistakes like this were extremely rare. She even offered to retest, but I could tell from her expression she didn't expect the results to change. As I sat there trying to process what I just heard, my mind raced. Biology wasn't something I thought about daily, but I couldn't stop replaying the basics I'd learned in school. My blood type was A. Lauren's was A. Jake's was something else entirely. For a moment, I convinced myself there had to be some kind of anomaly or skipped generation. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. After finding a donor match and ensuring Jake got the care he needed, the nurse gently suggested we consider genetic testing to clear up any confusion. Lauren immediately dismissed the idea, insisting it wasn't necessary. She even accused me of being paranoid. At first, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her. But the more she deflected and avoided eye contact, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right. I couldn't let it go. I needed answers. Without telling Lauren, I decided to do the test on my own. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, to confirm there was nothing to worry about. When the envelope arrived in the mail, I stared at it for what felt like hours. My hands shook as I opened it, unfolding the papers inside. At first, the medical jargon was a blur. But then I saw it. Probability of paternity, 0%. 0. I read it over and over, hoping I had misunderstood, but the truth was staring me in the face. Jake wasn't my biological son. I felt the air leave my lungs, My chest tightened and my head spun. I tried to find some explanation, some loophole that made sense of it all, but there was none. It had to be a mistake. It just had to be. When Lauren came home that evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I confronted her with the papers in my hand. At first, she tried to act confused, like she didn't understand what I was talking about, but as I pressed her, her facade began to crack. Tears filled her eyes, and she finally broke down, sobbing. When I asked her who Jake's father was, her response left me stunned. "It's Alex," she whispered, barely audible. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "Alex? My brother Alex?" She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I can't even describe what I felt in that moment. Rage, betrayal, and shock hit me all at once, like a tidal wave. Alex, the brother who had always overshadowed me, had now taken this from me too. Lauren tried to explain through her tears, saying it happened during a rough patch in our relationship that she thought we wouldn't last. But none of it mattered. The damage was done. My entire world felt like it had been ripped apart in an instant. I couldn't stay in the house. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly, trying to make sense of everything. How could the two people I trusted most betray me like this? When I finally went home, Lauren was waiting, still in tears. She begged me to stay, insisting it had been a mistake and that she regretted it every day. But her words felt hollow. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept thinking about Jake, his smile, his laugh, the way he called me dad without hesitation. To me, he was my son. But now, even those memories felt tainted. The betrayal had poisoned everything. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Jake laughing in the living room. It was the kind of pure, joyful sound only a child can make, but instead of lifting my spirits, it made my chest ache. How could something so innocent be wrapped up in such a betrayal? I stayed in bed for a few moments, gathering myself before heading out to face the day. Lauren was in the kitchen, her face puffy and red from crying all night. She glanced at me, but I avoided her gaze and went straight to Jake. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by his toys, completely unaware of the storm raging around him. "Dad, look," he said, holding up a tower of blocks he'd built. His voice was filled with pride, and I forced a smile as I knelt beside him. "That's amazing, buddy," I said, trying to focus on the moment. For Jake, nothing had changed. I was still his dad, his safe place. But for me, every interaction with him was bittersweet, a constant reminder of what I'd learned. Later that day, I decided to take Jake to the park. I needed to clear my head, and being with him always made me feel like I was doing something right. As he ran around, playing with other kids, I sat on a bench, my thoughts spiraling. The DNA test results were undeniable, and Lauren's confession replayed in my mind like a broken record. Alex, my own brother. The one person I'd spent my entire life trying to distance myself from had managed to take something else from me. The betrayal felt so calculated, so deliberate, even if Lauren insisted it wasn't. When we got home, Lauren was waiting, her face filled with hope that I might finally talk to her. I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. After putting Jake to bed, I sat down with her in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat. She nodded, wiping her hands on her jeans nervously. "How long?" I asked. "How long has this been going on?" Lauren hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "It was a few times," she said softly. "It happened years ago, before we were married." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So you were seeing him while we were together?" I asked, my voice trembling. She nodded. "I was confused," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You were always so focused on work, and Alex, he was just there. It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake." "A mistake that resulted in a child," I shot back, my voice rising. "Did he know? Did Alex know Jake was his?" She shook her head quickly. "No, he doesn't know. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell anyone. I thought if I kept it to myself, it wouldn't matter." Her words only made me angrier. "So you lied to me for 7 years, I said, my voice shaking. "You let me believe Jake was mine all this time." "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, standing up. "Hurt me? You didn't just hurt me, Lauren. You destroyed everything." I couldn't be in the same room with her anymore. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly through the city, my mind racing. I replayed Lauren's words over and over, trying to make sense of them. I thought about Alex, about how he'd always been around more than usual these past few years. Why? If he didn't know Jake was his, why was he so invested in my life all of a sudden? The pieces didn't add up, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I knew I couldn't ignore this. I needed answers from Alex. The next day, I drove to his apartment. I had no plan, no idea how the conversation would go, but I couldn't let this fester any longer. When I knocked on the door, Alex opened it with a smile. "Ethan, what's up?" he said, his voice cheerful, as if nothing was wrong. I didn't return his smile. "We need to talk," I said, my tone cold. His expression shifted, and he stepped aside to let me in. We sat in his living room, the air thick with tension. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. I didn't waste time beating around the bush. "Lauren told me everything," I said. Alex blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "Everything? What are you talking about?" he asked. "She told me about Jake," I said, my voice sharp. "About how he's your son." The color drained from his face, and for a moment, he looked like he might deny it. But then he slumped back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "She told you?" he muttered, almost to himself. "So you knew," I said, my voice rising. "You knew, and you've just been showing up to my house, playing the good uncle like nothing's wrong?" "It's not like that," Alex said defensively. "I didn't know for sure. I mean, I had a feeling, but Lauren never told me anything. I thought it was better not to ask." "Better not to ask?" I repeated, standing up. "You slept with my wife, had a child with her, and you thought it was better not to ask?" Alex stood up too, his expression shifting from defensive to angry. "You think this was easy for me?" he shot back. "I messed up, okay? I know I did, but I didn't know how to fix it, and I figured as long as you were happy, it didn't matter." "It didn't matter?" I said, my voice shaking. "You lied to me for 7 years, Alex. You let me believe Jake was mine. Do you even understand what you've done?" He didn't answer. He just looked away, guilt written all over his face. I didn't have the energy to keep yelling. The anger was still there, boiling under the surface, but I felt drained, like every ounce of fight had been pulled out of me. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said quietly, heading for the door. "Wait," Alex called after me, but I didn't stop. I walked out without another word, slamming the door behind me. Driving home, the weight in my chest only grew heavier. Confronting Alex hadn't brought the closure I thought it would. If anything, it left me feeling even more lost. When I got home, Lauren was sitting on the couch, her face weary from days of crying. She looked up at me, her expression pleading, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. I walked past her and went straight to Jake's room. He was playing on the floor, surrounded by his toys, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding around him. Seeing him like that, so pure and unaffected, brought a strange mix of comfort and pain. Sitting down beside him, I watched as he explained his latest Lego creation, his face lighting up with excitement. For a moment, I managed to push everything else aside and just be present with him. But as I tucked him into bed that night, his tiny hand clutching my arm, the weight of everything came crashing down again. I loved Jake with all my heart, but now I didn't know where to go from here. The foundation of my life had been shattered, and I wasn't sure how to rebuild it. All I knew was that for Jake's sake, I had to keep going. He was the one good thing I had left, and I wasn't going to let this betrayal take that away from me. In the days that followed, I tried to carry on for Jake's sake, but everything felt hollow. Lauren and I barely spoke. She hovered in the background, watching me with that mixture of guilt and desperation, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. The weight of what she'd done was too much. My focus stayed on Jake. Every moment with him, helping him with his homework, taking him to the park, reading him stories at bedtime, felt like the only grounding force in my life. But no matter how hard I tried, the knowledge of the truth lingered like a shadow over every interaction. One evening, after Jake had gone to bed, Lauren sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Ethan, please," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk. I can't stand this silence anymore." I stared at her for a long moment, the words piling up in my throat. Finally, I spoke. "Talk about what, Lauren?" About how you betrayed me? About how you lied for 7 years? What is there to say? My voice was calm, but the edge in it was sharp enough to make her flinch. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she clasped her hands together. I know I made a mistake, she said. I know I hurt you, and I can never take it back. But I love you, Ethan. I love our family. Jake loves you. You're his dad in every way that matters. Please, let's work through this. We can fix it. Fix it? I said, shaking my head. Lauren, this isn't a broken plate you can glue back together. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed the foundation of our life. Every time I look at you, I see Alex. Every time I look at Jake, I think about the fact that you kept this from me. I don't know if that's something I can ever get past. She sobbed quietly, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly swallowed by the weight of her betrayal. That night, I slept on the couch again. The thought of sharing a bed with her, of pretending things were normal, was unbearable. As I stared at the ceiling, I thought about what I needed to do. The uncertainty of it all, our marriage, my relationship with Jake, the future, was eating away at me. I needed clarity, and I knew I couldn't find it in the state of limbo we were living in. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not to file for divorce, not yet, but to understand my rights. I needed to know where I stood with Jake. He might not have been my biological son, but I'd raised him since the day he was born. I was on his birth certificate, and I was the only father he'd ever known. The lawyer assured me that in the eyes of the law, my role as Jake's father wouldn't be dismissed simply because of biology. It was a relief, but it didn't erase the pain of the situation. That evening, Lauren handed me an envelope. Her hands were trembling, and her face was pale. I took a DNA test with Jake, she said quietly. I wanted you to have this. You deserve to see the truth for yourself. I didn't open it right away. Part of me felt like I didn't need to. I already knew what it would say. But later that night, when the house was silent, I unfolded the papers. There it was in black and white. Jake wasn't my biological son. Seeing it spelled out was like a punch to the gut, even though I'd already known. The days that followed were suffocating. Jake remained blissfully unaware, but the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. Lauren and I barely spoke, and even Jake started to pick up on the strain. One night, as I was tucking him into bed, he asked, Dad, are you mad at me? The question broke something in me. No, buddy, I said, hugging him tightly. I'm not mad at you. I could never be mad at you. The next morning, I sat Lauren down. I'm filing for divorce, I said simply. She didn't argue, didn't try to change my mind. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes to make this as easy as possible for Jake. Her calm acceptance caught me off guard, but it didn't change my decision. Within days, I moved into a small apartment nearby. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it gave me space to breathe. Telling Jake about the separation was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He didn't understand why we couldn't all live together anymore. And his questions cut me to the core. But I promised him that nothing would change between us, that I'd always be there for him, no matter what. Lauren and I managed to maintain a civil relationship for Jake's sake. We coordinated schedules, kept conversations brief, and tried to keep things as normal as possible for him. But every interaction reminded me of the betrayal, and the resentment lingered like a wound that wouldn't heal. As for Alex, I cut him out of my life completely. True to my word, I told him to stay away from me, from Lauren, and from Jake. He sent a text once, a short, guilt-ridden message that I deleted without responding. Forgiveness might come someday, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Despite everything, my bond with Jake remained strong. He was my anchor, the one bright spot in the chaos. We spent weekends building Lego towers, exploring parks, and watching movies. He didn't know the truth, and I wasn't sure when or if I'd ever tell him. For now, all that mattered was being there for him. Life wasn't easy, but with each passing day, I started to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe I'd never fully escaped the pain of what had happened, but I was learning to live with it. I was learning to focus on what truly mattered. In the weeks that followed the move, I settled into a new rhythm of life. The apartment felt strange at first, too quiet, too empty, but it also felt like a sanctuary. I started decorating it with things Jake had made, drawings, small crafts, and even a few of his school projects. It wasn't much, but it made the space feel like home. Jake visited every weekend, and we made the most of our time together. Those moments were pure, untouched by the betrayal that had torn everything else apart. His laughter, his excitement over the simplest things, it reminded me of what was still good in my life. Lauren and I continued to navigate the co-parenting arrangement. She kept her word about making things as easy as possible for Jake. Drop-offs were cordial but distant, and while we exchanged necessary updates about Jake, there was no lingering conversation. I couldn't look at her without remembering everything that had happened, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. She had started seeing a therapist, and once mentioned that she hoped counseling might help her understand what she'd done and why. I didn't respond. It wasn't my place to fix her anymore. Alex, on the other hand, remained a ghost in my life. True to my demand, he stayed away. Mutual friends occasionally mentioned him in passing, but I made it clear I didn't want to hear about him. He was a reminder of the worst kind of betrayal, and I had no room for that in my life anymore. Forgiveness felt like a mountain too steep to climb, and I wasn't ready to even start the journey. One evening, after a particularly fun day with Jake, he asked me something that stopped me cold. "Dad, why don't you come to the house anymore? Why don't we all live together like before?" I froze for a moment, searching for the right words. "Buddy," I said gently, "sometimes adults make mistakes, and it's hard to fix them. But what's important is that I'm always here for you, no matter what. That won't ever change." He seemed to accept that, but his question lingered in my mind long after he'd fallen asleep. As the months passed, I began focusing on myself for the first time in years. I started running again, something I hadn't done since Jake was born. It became a form of therapy, a way to clear my mind and channel the anger and hurt into something productive. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my marriage, and found solace in their support. Slowly, I started to rebuild a sense of who I was outside of being a husband and father. Jake remained my constant. We built traditions in my new apartment: Friday night movie marathons, Saturday morning pancake experiments, and afternoons spent at the park. He didn't seem to notice the strain between Lauren and me anymore, and for that, I was grateful. He deserved stability, and I was determined to give it to him. Then one day, Lauren surprised me. During a routine drop-off, she handed me a letter. "I've been working on this in therapy," she said quietly. "You don't have to read it, but I thought you should have it." I nodded, tucking the envelope into my pocket without a word. Later that night, after Jake was asleep, I opened it. The letter was an apology, raw, unfiltered, and painfully honest. She wrote about her guilt, her regret, and her love for Jake and me. She admitted she didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped I'd find peace, even if it meant moving on without her. Reading her words stirred a mix of emotions. Part of me felt a sliver of pity, but another part was still too wounded to care. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness might come someday, but not yet. Not while the pain still felt so fresh. Around this time, I also received unexpected news from work. My boss, recognizing the effort I'd put in despite everything going on in my personal life, offered me a promotion. It came with more responsibility and a significant pay increase, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward. The promotion was a reminder that I was capable, that my life wasn't defined by the mistakes of others. The most profound change, however, came one quiet Sunday evening. Jake and I were sitting on the couch, flipping through an old photo album. He pointed to a picture of the three of us, me, Lauren, and baby Jake, and asked, "Dad, were you happy back then?" The question caught me off guard, but I nodded. "I was, Jake," I said honestly, "because you were there. And no matter what happens, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." That moment crystallized something for me. No matter how broken things felt, Jake was my son. He was my purpose, my anchor. The love I had for him wasn't dependent on DNA or biology. It was something deeper, something unshakable. For all the pain Lauren and Alex had caused, they couldn't take that away from me. As I sat there with Jake, his small hand resting on mine, I realized I didn't need to have all the answers right now. Life would continue, one day at a time, and I would navigate it as best I could. My focus was clear: be the father Jake deserved and build a life that both of us could be proud of. The past might have shaped me, but it didn't define me. My story wasn't over yet.